This is my 43rd video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge, and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my lengthy series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part is the 17th, dealing with my third layout made using mainly Hornby EZ Track. See the prior video, part 27, for my reasons for wanting to try a Hornby EZ Track layout when I already had an OO gauge layout using Bachmann EZ Track. This part covers my build of the Dapol, previously Airfix, Footbridge plastic kit C004. As I said I might at the end of my previous video, I decided to do this fairly quick build of a plastic kit to make a bit of a break from building card kits, of which I've been doing quite a lot lately, with more still to come. Here's the kit the way Dapol sell it now. Plastic parts in a bag, together with a folded sheet of instructions stapled below a folded product ID sheet. Here's the package from the back so you can see the parts. I remember buying kits packaged like this from the corner shop when I was a boy. I paid 1 shilling and 3pence, I recall, for a standard kit like this, so the equivalent of about 6p in modern British money, or about 15 cents Canadian. However, when Airfix first sold this kit, they actually packaged it in a box, which was much better. Packing, shipping and selling kits in bags like this tends to result in bent and or broken parts, which is frustrating. Here are the parts for this kit taken out of the bag and given a preliminary sort. Actually, none of these parts were damaged. However, they did have a great many flaws in the form of casting errors, lots of flash and very marked ejection points. Dapol are quite aware of problems likely with these kits. They specifically say that parts may get bent during transit or by prolonged storage, and suggest that you should try to straighten any bent parts after softening them in hot water. They also mention that the moulds are 50 years old, so imperfections are inevitable. If you could find one, you'd probably be better off buying an old Airfix version of this kit made when the moulds were still at least fairly new. The instructions indicate that this kit is somewhat adaptable. You could even combine 2 kits to make a more complex bridge. However, the most basic point of adaptation is that the bridge can be built with a longer or a shorter span. For the full length from the kit, the walkway is used as it comes, and flat sections to which advertising posters can be attached are fitted in the middle of the span between the railing segments. To make a shorter bridge, the flat advertising boards are omitted and the main span walkway is cut down. I stuck parts together with transparent tape in order to try the possible spans against the platforms on my layout. The upper set of railings here has an advertising board in the middle as for the longer span. The lower set is for the shorter span without the advertising board. For the full width of the bridge, it's also necessary to allow for the landings, which will be at the bottom of the short stairway at each end of the span. Accordingly, I have put the landing parts beside the parts for the shorter span here. Clearly, even the shorter span is really going to be wider than I'd like, and I definitely don't want to build the longer span. In order to make the bridge with the shorter span, the main span walkway needs to be shortened by cutting at the grooves to remove the end sections. So here I've used a craft knife to cut off those end sections which won't be needed. I figured that the best way to assemble the centre railings and the span walkway would be to glue the railings together first, as this would make it clearer how to centre the walkway. Then I glued the walkway onto the railings for one side, centering it as well as I could. Then I glued the short stairways to the side railing, lining up the tops of the steps with the span walkway. These steps can only go on one way. If you try to put them on the wrong way up, the steps clearly don't sit at all right. Once the walkway and steps were glued to one side, I attached the railings for the other side. This is the next part of the instructions. Frankly, I couldn't really understand exactly what they were trying to say, so I worked more by examining the parts themselves and trial fitting. I also found it a bit odd that the instructions used the word clip for what I would have thought were clearly meant to be smoke deflectors. The girder parts for the end landing supports were particularly badly cast, with a ton of flash and very marked ejection points. It took quite a while using knife and emery board to clean them up to the point where they were close to presentable and might assemble okay. It seemed to me essentially inevitable that this was how the short and long girder parts were supposed to go together with the landings. Apart from anything else, the landings need to be level with the bottom of the steps from the span, and the rise of the railings above the landing needs to be the same as the rise of the railings at the bottom of the steps, so the tops of the railings will meet properly. The parts did also seem to fit together quite well like this. I wanted to have my stairways at both ends turn at the landings, turning to the same side of the bridge. I bore this in mind as I assembled the landings and their supports. It's possible to assemble these to have the steps turn in either direction or to go straight. Once I had the landing assembled with one long and one short support, I attached the other long and short support to complete the end section. And the same process was used to assemble the end section at the other end in the correct orientation. So now I had my main span and the two end landings with their supports. Those end sections then attached to bottom bases, with the bottoms of their legs sitting around the corners of the central raised section at the base. Now the span can be assembled to the end sections. So far the assembly was going fairly well, although some problems were already developing. As with the railings fitted together as they pretty well had to go, there was a gap between the bottom of the steps and the landing. I don't see how this could have been avoided other than by substantial modification of the parts. The gap at the other end wasn't quite so big, although there was still an obvious gap. Things got worse when it came to attaching the final sections of the steps to go down to ground level. If the railings were glued together at the top, the bottom of the steps ended up hovering in mid-air, something like 4 scale feet off the ground, not too convenient for passengers. Conversely, if I forced the bottom of the steps to go more or less to ground level, the railings wouldn't join at the top, as can be seen here. The steps are basically going to ground level, but then it forces a gap in between the stair railings and the landing railings. I could have tried adding steps, extra steps at the bottom, I suppose. Instead, I just forced the steps to go down to the ground, and then fudged apart from one of the cut-off sections of the span walkway to fill the gap in the railings. At the other end, I was just about able to force things together so that the steps went to ground level without adding an extra part. So there was the bridge basically complete. I didn't put the smoke deflectors on at this point, as I wanted to line those up with my tracks, although the instructions said to only attach one clip to the shorter span, but I was putting it over 2 tracks, so I wanted 2. Here's the bridge from the other side at this point. I don't think my fudging in assembly is too obvious, and it should be even less obvious after painting and weathering. I took the bridge to the layout to try it on the platforms. It was really still wider than I liked, as I didn't want to push the platforms back further from the tracks. The bases to the end sections butted against the back walls for the platforms, and so pushed the platforms a bit further apart. I laid the bridge down in order to see where the smoke deflectors would need to be fitted in order to have them over my tracks. Back on the bench, I fitted the smoke deflectors in my determined positions. I had to file down their ends quite a bit in order to get them to fit across the span. I used a cutting disc and a rotary tool to cut off the sides of the end bases where they protruded beyond the girders, in order to minimize as much as possible the separation between the platforms that would be required. After cutting off the ends with the Dremel tool, which left them rather rough, I smoothed things down with an emery board. I checked the fit back on the layout again. I would have been happier if the bridge were a little shorter to allow the platforms to go closer to the tracks. In hindsight, I should maybe have tried to cut down the span a bit more, although it would have been difficult to keep the railing girders looking sensible unless a whole X section of them was removed. I guess I could have done that. The smoke deflectors were pretty much lined up over my tracks, which was the idea of them. They were supposed to reduce the amount that smoke and steam from locos passing underneath would bother passengers on the bridge. I painted the whole assembled bridge green. Then I used a silver pencil to add some highlights to suggest metal construction. Then I applied some rust colour, trying to keep it spread out here and there and reasonably subtle. Here's the finished bridge on the layout. Definitely not a masterpiece, but I guess it doesn't look too bad. It does look a bit on the clunky side. The girders are perhaps rather overscale in thickness. Next, I guess, will be the build of the Super Quick Railway Hotel, as that's the largest building still to be done, and it will be nice to finally replace the big white template in the middle of the layout with the actual building.